Well, Secretary General, very good of you to talk to us here on Sky News tonight. Now, let's discuss these reports of Russian troops and some equipment apparently being withdrawn from the vicinity of Ukraine. And you'll be aware of the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, tweeting that Western war propaganda has failed. It was humiliated and destroyed without a shot being fired. Does NATO see real evidence of a de-escalation here?
Not so far. We have not seen any de-escalation, any withdrawal of Russian troops and equipment. But of course, we hope that will happen because we are calling on Russia to de-escalate and to engage in dialogue with Russia. With NATO and NATO allies to find a political solution.
Well, if there is no de-escalation, are we still on track with those intelligence warnings from the last few days and hours from the United States, from the UK, I'm sure from NATO as well, that Russia is in a position to invade at any time, and it could happen in 24 hours' time?
So what we have seen over the last weeks is a very significant Russian military build-up. They have amassed unprecedented number of combat-ready troops in and around Ukraine, and also deployed a lot of high-end capabilities, missiles, artillery, planes, and many other enablers, support to those combat troops. So they can launch an attack on Ukraine with hardly any or no warning time whatsoever. This is, of course, a very dangerous situation to be in. And that's the reason why we are sending a very clear message to Russia that if they once again use violence and military force against Ukraine, that will come with a high cost. And we have also increased our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. And the UK is leading in those efforts. And I welcome the efforts by the United Kingdom to both engage with Russia, but also to increase the NATO presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
So would you say to those that read into these reports of some troop withdrawals, of a de-escalation, some hope that perhaps violence may be avoided, don't be fooled by that. This could be, I think it's called maskirovska by the Russians, a frenzy of different feints from different directions to conceal the intended final lethal punch. This could be actually a smokescreen.
We have not seen any withdrawal or de-escalation on the ground, but we will continue to monitor very closely. We will follow what they are doing, and we call on them to de-escalate. And it's not too late to Russia to remove forces, to start to engage in real efforts to find a political solution and to stop the preparations for aggressive actions. So we have this dual-track approach. We need to send a clear message that there will be costs, that NATO is increasing its presence in the eastern part of the alliance, but at the same time that we are ready to sit down with Russia and engage in diplomatic efforts.
Well, it would be appreciated, Secretary General, if you could give us as detailed a picture as you can of a possible political and diplomatic solution with Russia that satisfies its objections to NATO expansion. Now, I know you sent NATO's proposals alongside the US to Russia back in January, and they talk about arms control, missiles, areas like that. Could there be some common ground?
Absolutely. We have seen before that it's possible to agree with Russia on arms control, and we can do that again. For instance, when it comes to missiles, when it comes to different types of offensive weapons, but that has to be reciprocal, balanced and verifiable. But we are ready to engage in that. We're also ready to sit down with Russia and to, for instance, address issues like transparency on military activities to prevent any misunderstanding, miscalculations, and that will also help to reduce tensions. But we are not willing, not ready to compromise on core principles, the right of every nation to choose its own path, including whether it wants to belong to or not belong to an alliance as NATO. And then we cannot compromise on this idea that we don't have the right to protect those allies that are in the eastern part of the alliance. We don't have first and second class NATO members. We have 30 NATO allies, and we, of course, must have the right to protect and defend all of them.
So could a possible solution be something like this, that, of course, the Ukrainians' right to join NATO remains there as a sovereign nation, but we take on board what Olaf Scholz said yesterday when he was in Kiev, that practically it's not on the agenda, NATO membership. President Zelensky of Ukraine says membership remains a dream, and that NATO then says to the Russians, well, of course, we reserve the right for the Ukrainians to join us, but we will never put any missiles on their soil.
First of all, when it comes to arms control, we have made it clear again and again that we are ready to engage in agreements, talks about arms control, and we have done that before. In 1987, we had what we call the INF agreement, not limiting, but actually removing, banning all intermediate range weapons, both both nuclear capable and conventional capable intermediate range missiles. We have seen also significant limitations on the longer range missiles. So we have proven before that it is possible to limit, to reduce, to actually ban different categories of missiles. And we can do that again as long as it's balanced. Second, Ukraine is a sovereign nation, so it's for them to decide whether they want to apply for membership or not. And then it's for 30 allies to decide on the issue whether Ukraine is ready, meet the NATO standards. And that principle we cannot compromise on. Then I think that any successful diplomatic effort to find a solution has to have a minimum of confidentiality. So I don't think it's wise if I go into all the possible and impossible options for a common ground between Russia and NATO allies. We have to meet, and that's exactly why we have invited Russia to meet in the NATO-Russia Council and in other formats, to sit down and listen to their concerns, but also share our concerns and then try to find a common way forward.
Well, we appreciate you going as far as you could there, Secretary General. And can I just ask you as well, when we're talking about attacks on Ukraine and indeed on other NATO members, are we over-concentrating on the hardware and the personnel? I'm talking, of course, as NATO has warned about in the past, cyber attacks. Russia is in a position to cause a great deal of damage.
So what we see now is that Russia has the capabilities in place to launch a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. But also, of course, there can be other types of aggressive actions, a more limited military incursion, subversion, attempts to topple the Ukrainian government, or big, very damaging cyber attacks. We need to be prepared for all of that. And we also need to be able to identify and actually hold accountable and responsible Russia, even if they do something which is below or not a full-fledged invasion. And that's why we share so much information in NATO, why we need to be vigilant and continue to expose Russia on what they are planning for and the different actions, because we need to be able to hold them accountable if they do something which is not a full-fledged invasion, but still a very aggressive action against Ukraine, for instance, cyber attacks.
And lastly, I must just put you some of the Russian characterizations. I know you're well aware of them, but interesting to get your response. First and foremost, that Russia says it has a perfect right to carry out military exercises wherever it likes on its own territory and with its allies. And also, it attests that NATO is not just a defensive organisation. It does initiate actions such as in Serbia and Libya. So first, what we have seen is that NATO is a defensive alliance because we have been there to defend and protect all NATO allies for more than 70 years. Then, for instance, the Balkans, we acted because we saw atrocities, we saw violence against innocent civilians, and NATO helped to end 2 brutal ethnic wars in the Balkans, and we have stayed there since then based on the UN mandate. We also had the UN mandate in Libya. So NATO is and will remain a defensive alliance. Then I've forgotten your first question. just the fact that Russia says it can carry out exercises on its own territory wherever and whenever it likes?
Well, the answer to that is that, of course, every nation has the right to exercise their own troops on their own territory. That's absolutely acceptable. But this is not a normal exercise. This is the biggest concentration of combat-ready forces in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And they are close to Ukraine's borders. They are partly also inside the Ukrainian territory, in Crimea and also in Donbass. And this is unprecedented. And they have all the enablers in place to launch a full-fledged invasion with hardly any warning time at all. So this is an unprecedented military build-up. It is unjustified and unexplained, combined with threatening rhetoric, because what they have said is that if we don't give in to the Russian demands, then there will be what they call military technical consequences. So not only military build-up, but also threatening rhetoric, combined with the track record of Russia. Russia has invaded Ukraine before. So military build-up, threatening rhetoric and a bad track record, of course, then we have to take that very seriously, and that's exactly what NATO is doing, and UK is very much part of that. I'm thankful for all UK's contributions to our collective defence.
And just as you've touched on, the irony of the Russian position, the Russian actions, is that rather than having less NATO close to its borders, this is going to lead to more NATO presence.
Yes, that's exactly what we have seen also before. NATO didn't have any combat troops in the eastern part of the alliance before 2014. Then after the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, we deployed for the first time in our history battle groups to the Baltic countries and Poland. United Kingdom leads the battle group in Estonia. We have also invested more in defense. We have more exercises. We have more presence in air, on land and at sea as a direct consequence of the aggressive actions by Russia in 2014. So if the purpose of the Russian aggressive actions is to get less NATO close to the borders, they get the exact opposite. They get more NATO. And that's the case also now. We have increased our presence in the eastern part of the alliance as a direct response to the very substantial Russian military build-up in and around Ukraine.
Secretary General, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me.